Korea that year when I learned I was really curious of how the art of tie and dye is performed. And some of you probably know what botany is. Botany comes from the word bondage. Bondage means, well, we know in San Francisco what it means, but bondage is tying threads, using wood clamps as Angelina does, tying threads around fabric to make a texture and a color resist. And I wanted to know how this was done. So I had seen examples like this, which is total traditional Indian, a hand woven shawl. All this is little double dyed dots of botany and then hand embroidered with mirrors. This piece is, gosh, about 20 years old. I still love it. And then, but how do they get the dots on there? I mean, how do you actually tie this stuff? I mean, how is this done? I really wanted to know. So that's what I did in my Fulbright grant. I learned how to do it, but instead of doing it very traditionally, I ended up doing it a little bit more Andrea style. So this is done with natural dyes. And of course, I can't tie those little fine dots that these big men can tie, but I was able to do a scarf line like this. But here's what really blows me away. And these types of masterpiece tie and dye pieces. This is done on a very heavy satin silk with this heavy gold border. And it takes a master craftsman, I'd say a good 3 weeks to tie something like this. It's a long time. And it's tied and dyed in subsequent stages, and it's just, well, I don't have to say anything. It speaks for itself. And then my other fascination for that particular type of handwork, which also comes from the same region of Gujarat called Bhuj, is block print. So these are examples of block printed fabric. This is called ajrak, and it's all hand printed, of course, with natural dyes. This is about a 10-meter piece, and I'll leave these up here and anyone can come up after, or unless Alexander wants to come up now. This is a masterpiece block print. It's called an ajrak shawl. So the dupatta, that's what they call it in India. And so those are all natural dyes. There's about 8 blocks used to print this. And this is done on a hand-loomed cotton piece that comes from the south of India. And these are absolutely glorious. And so what I do now is I procure the shawls and I bring them to my craftspeople that I've known for all these years, and I ask them to print these for us, and he does so. So this is not something that you can easily come up with, find in India, actually. A good friend of mine, Anne, who I see in the crowd here, was on a trip to India several years ago, and she actually phoned me up from India and said, I cannot find anything like what I see in your shop. Would you please hold this and this and this for me? I said, oh yes, I'm quite flattered, I'll do that. So I spent nearly a year in this really small and dusty town. I experienced a horrific cyclone that knocked out the power for 2.5 weeks right in the middle of the hot season. I remember one fine afternoon I went to visit my tailor who was working on some interesting designs. This was towards the end of my Fulbright. He was stitching these amazing suits that I was going to show in this fashion show that was happening in Vienna, Austria. A friend of mine said, oh, come, we're having this beautiful fashion show and you can be one of the designers fresh from India. And I said, yeah, I want to do that. How exciting. So I had these silk suits that were being stitched by my tailor, and I went to check on some of the details with him. And the atmosphere was really kind of crazy that day, and it was just kind of blustery and windy, and my tailor, Toole, Angelina remembers him, sweetest man, he and I actually had a little disagreement about these buttons, and I never argue with him. I mean, it just was like, something was off that day. We had this little argument, and then the wind was picking up, and then there was this man who would just was incessantly banging outside the tailoring shop, and that felt like static, and suddenly there was this explosion, and this like electrical box exploded, and all these sparks were flying, and I just said, okay, we just have to stop, this is not right. So, walked away from that, and sure enough, this big cyclone developed, and I locked myself in my workshop for like 6 hours while the winds were just howling, and I could hear trees crashing and all sorts of things falling down, and I dared to open the door, and I looked outside, and the water was up to here, and there's this cow that was trying to walk upstream, which was the road up until a couple hours ago. It was just like this weird thing had happened. Well, that knocked the power out of all of that region for the next 2.5 weeks. And that was right in the middle of the hot season. Temperatures were nearing 110, 115, and we had no electricity, no fans. Running water, forget it. And it was a really challenging time. I remember sitting in my friend Ranja's shop, and sitting under that fan and just looking at it and praying that it would start. Every once in a while it would just kind of come to life and just start spinning, and I'd say, Raju, the fan is starting. And we'd all gather around and stand underneath it, and then it would just peter out. It was really, really challenging, but it gave me a great, deep appreciation for the everyday struggles that most people in India live with. A lot of them still don't have electricity and plumbing and those types of things, so it gave me a good idea of what that was like. Speaking of heat, I'd like to talk about my sweater project. These days, everyone loves the idea of recycling. So this is what I do and how I recycle my own small part and how I make sweaters. Long before I opened my shop, I used to stitch in my studio sweaters made from slightly worn, mottled, stained cashmere merino wools. I would just cut around that, and I'd serge together 4 or 5 sweaters to make one beautiful sweater. And that was in the late 90s, and I used to sell them on Madison Avenue at Julie's Artisans Gallery in New York City, and through my own trunk shows and studio sales. But now I've trained my own tailors in India to do this. And with the help, this was John's idea, and he suggested you can train your fellows over there to stitch these sweaters. And I said, well, I don't have the right machines. Well, let's get the right machines. Well, how do we get them up to Bhuj? Well, they have the machines in Bombay, they're specialized. Well, we got the machines in Bombay, and we lugged them to the airport. We begged them to let us board them on the plane. Big machines and motors and tables. We had like 90 kilos of excess baggage. And we told them it was part of our earthquake relief project, which it was. And they waived the extra baggage fees. So that's how we got one of those up there. But thanks to John's big vision, that's forever changed my workshop and what my tailors are able to do for a living now. And they love stitching my sweaters. You're going to see a couple of them today in the show. So I can't wait to show you that. But one of the important ingredients to making my patchwork sweaters are sweaters. So India being a really hot climate by and large, you don't see many sweaters available. So I had to try to figure out a source. Delhi does get cold in the winter, and John and I saw some wonderful examples of possibilities. Well, there's guys selling stacks of used sweaters on the street. They must get them from somewhere. So where do we go find these sweaters? So he said, let's go in July. That's off-season. You'll be able to get them at a cheap price. This is great. Let's do that. So we went to Delhi, and we literally, on the way from the airport, we started grilling the taxi driver. Where can we find sweaters? Sweaters? What do you want sweaters for? And he said, it is not cold. It's not winter time. Yeah, we know. It's very hot. And after like maybe 4 or 5 taxi drivers, we finally got one who got us. He figured out what it was I wanted. He said, okay, tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., I pick you up, I take you to the sweaters. I said, 6 a.m., I'm not a morning person. I said, 7:30? He goes, Madam, 6 a.m. I know why he meant 6 a.m. Because by the time noon rolls around, it's 115 degrees, and he can't do anything. So you start your day early in that hot season. So he drove us out to the suburbs. I could never, ever find this place again. Way out there. And he said, here's where you'll find your sweaters. And so we went in and went through all this labyrinth of little houses, and sure enough, this pack of kids is following us. European, they're saying. And then following us to this house. And how the heck they got this big bale of sweaters inside this brick house? It's probably like 300 square feet, and it was like the elephant was in the room, and how'd they get it in there? The door's only this big. We never figured that out. But it was in there. The guy was sitting on top of the bale, and he said, "There are your sweaters." Excuse me. And I said, "Well, okay, great, but I need to see them." So they cut open the straps. Boom! It exploded in that room. And piles of sweaters were just flying out everywhere. No, here's your sweaters. And I said, "But I need only the fine choice. I wanted to pick and choose the best sweaters." So here we got sweaters flying. Yes, no, maybe. Yes, no, yes, no, maybe. By the time I filled maybe 20 in each pile, my skin was sweating. I was covered with lint. I was itching, and I had lint up my nose, all over my face. This is the glamorous side of fashion design. There was a little doorway and a window, and both those oxygen supplies were cut off because all the neighborhood kids were pressed against those openings, just in awe of what we were doing. Like, sweaters had never been so exciting. And I had to shoo them away every once in a while. And it was hard to do that because they were really curious, but I needed some air. We had one of those little barely squeaking fans overhead. So about 4 or 5 hours of that, we were ready to collapse, went back to the hotel, slept for I think 3 or 4 hours, went back that evening and did that. We did that for 2 days in a row and amassed 900 sweaters. That was the hardest job, I'll tell you. Then we had to get the sweaters from that location to my workshop, 1,000 kilometers away. How do you do that? So we hired a little tractor. We actually hired a tractor. And we had one fellow who was pressing all those sweaters with a big heavy iron, and another one was putting them in these smaller bales, and we had about 5 or 6 bales of sweaters. We loaded them up into the tractor, and old sweaters they want to get rid of, and I appreciate the donations. My mother looks at the yard sales and Salvation Army and washes them in Downy and ships them to me. So it's a big part of what I do, my sweaters. If anyone thinks being a fashion designer in India is glamorous, let me tell you, it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of sweat and pounding the pavement and running around. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I love it. I love the color, I love the people, I love the passion that they hold for their textile traditions, which are outrageously fantastic. And I can't wait to show you my beautiful models. Yay!